The grand halls of Ravencrest Palace echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps as King Edmund Ashworth made his way through the marble corridors. At 67 years old, he had ruled the kingdom of Valdoria for nearly 3 decades, but tonight something felt different. The weight of the crown seemed heavier than usual, and an unexplained unease had settled in his chest since morning. The autumn rain pelted against the tall Gothic windows, casting dancing shadows across the ornate tapestries that lined the walls. Edmund paused before a portrait of his late father, King William, whose stern gaze seemed to follow him wherever he went in the palace. The old king had always emphasized duty above all else, a lesson that had shaped Edmund's entire reign. His marriage to Queen Isabella had been arranged 35 years ago, a union designed to strengthen ties between Valdoria and the neighboring kingdom of Meridia. What had begun as a political alliance had gradually blossomed into genuine affection, though Edmund often wondered if true love had ever existed between them. Isabella was elegant, dutiful, and perfectly suited for royal life, but there had always been an invisible wall between them, built from years of protocol and public expectations. As Edmund rounded the corner toward the private wing of the palace, he noticed something unusual. The door to Isabella's personal study, which was typically closed during her evening correspondence time, stood slightly ajar. Warm light spilled from the crack, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices. This was odd, as Isabella had mentioned during dinner that she would be retiring early due to a persistent headache. Curiosity overrode his usual respect for privacy, and Edmund approached the door quietly. Through the narrow opening, he could see Isabella seated at her antique writing desk, but she was not alone. A man in civilian clothes sat across from her, leaning forward intently as they spoke in hushed tones. Edmund's initial thought was that perhaps one of the palace advisors had come for an urgent consultation, but something about the scene struck him as peculiar. The man was younger than Edmund by at least 20 years, with dark hair and an athletic build that suggested he was not among the usual courtiers or government officials. His clothing, while well-tailored, lacked the formal quality expected in royal presence. More troubling still was the intimate nature of their conversation. Isabella's hand rested near a small wooden box on the desk, and her expression held an intensity that Edmund rarely witnessed during their own private moments. Edmund strained to hear their words, but the thick stone walls of the ancient palace muffled most of their conversation. He caught only fragments. "Can't continue like this." From Isabella, and "promised you." From the mysterious visitor. The man reached across the desk and briefly touched Isabella's hand, a gesture that sent a chill through Edmund's entire body. For nearly 5 minutes, Edmund remained frozen in the corridor, watching this strange tableau unfold. His mind raced through possible explanations, each more troubling than the last. Isabella had always been beyond reproach in matters of propriety and duty. She had never given him reason to question her loyalty or commitment to their marriage and the crown. Yet here was evidence of a secret relationship that she had concealed from him entirely. The sound of approaching footsteps from the main corridor forced Edmund to retreat quickly to his own chambers. His heart pounded as he tried to process what he had witnessed. Sleep would not come easily that night, as questions and doubts swirled through his mind like the storm clouds gathering over the palace grounds. By morning, Edmund had convinced himself that there must be an innocent explanation. Perhaps the man was a distant relative seeking assistance, or a charitable case that Isabella was supporting privately. She had always been generous with causes that touched her heart, often without informing him of the details. Yet the memory of their intimate posture and the secrecy surrounding the meeting continued to gnaw at him throughout the following day. Edmund decided to observe more carefully, though he felt conflicted about essentially spying on his own wife. During breakfast, Isabella appeared perfectly normal, discussing their upcoming state visit to the Republic of Astoria and inquiring about his meetings with the parliamentary delegation. Her demeanor showed no signs of the intensity he had witnessed the previous evening, which only deepened his confusion and concern. The next few days passed in a blur of official duties and growing anxiety. Edmund found himself studying Isabella's behavior for any signs of deception or unusual activity. He noticed that she had been receiving more private correspondence than usual, letters that she read quickly before tucking them away in her personal belongings. When he casually inquired about her correspondence during one of their evening walks through the palace gardens, Isabella's response was vague and evasive. "Oh, just the usual social obligations and charitable matters," she had said with a wave of her hand. "Nothing that would interest you, my dear." But Edmund was interested, more than he cared to admit. The foundation of trust that had supported their marriage for over 3 decades suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. He began to question not only Isabella's recent behavior, but also their entire relationship. Had there been other secrets over the years that he had simply failed to notice? The turning point came exactly 1 week after his initial discovery. Edmund had finished his evening meetings earlier than expected and decided to take a different route back to the royal quarters. As he passed through the library wing, he heard familiar voices coming from the private reading room that Isabella sometimes used for quiet reflection. This time, Edmund did not hesitate. He approached the partially open door and positioned himself where he could observe without being seen. What he witnessed sent shockwaves through his entire being and would forever change the course of their lives together. Inside the private reading room, Isabella sat on the velvet sofa with the same mysterious man from a week earlier. But this time, their interaction was unmistakably intimate. The man held Isabella's hands in his, and she was crying softly as he spoke to her in soothing tones. Most shocking of all was the small child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, who sat quietly playing with wooden toys on the ornate carpet nearby. Edmund's legs felt weak as the full implications of what he was seeing began to sink in. The child had Isabella's distinctive green eyes and delicate features, but the darker hair and stronger jawline clearly came from the man who was comforting his wife. This was not a business meeting or a charitable consultation. This was a secret family that Isabella had hidden from him for years. "Marcus, you know how impossible this situation has become," Isabella was saying, her voice thick with emotion. "Edmund is starting to ask questions, and the staff has begun to notice my frequent absences from the palace. We cannot keep meeting like this without eventually being discovered." Marcus, as Edmund now knew him, squeezed Isabella's hands gently. "I understand your concerns, but little Thomas needs his mother. These monthly visits are all we have, and they mean everything to him. Look at how happy he is when he sees you." As if on cue, the child looked up from his toys and smiled at Isabella with pure adoration. "Mama Bella," he said in a sweet, clear voice that cut through Edmund's heart like a blade. "Will you read me the story about the brave knight again?" Isabella's face softened as she reached for a children's book from the side table. "Of course, my darling. Come sit with me." Edmund watched in stunned silence as his wife of 35 years gathered the child onto her lap and began reading in the gentle, maternal tone he had never heard her use before. The sight was both beautiful and devastating. Here was Isabella in a role he had never imagined her in, displaying a warmth and tenderness that had somehow been absent from their own relationship. The harsh reality of their situation began to crystallize in Edmund's mind. Isabella had clearly had an affair years ago, resulting in the birth of this child. Rather than confessing or seeking divorce, she had chosen to maintain the fiction of their marriage while secretly mothering another man's child. The deception was breathtaking in its scope and duration. Marcus noticed Isabella's distress and reached over to stroke her hair comfortingly. "Perhaps it's time to consider more permanent arrangements," he said quietly. "Thomas is old enough now to ask questions about why he can't live with his mother, and you're clearly suffering from this divided life." "You know that's impossible," Isabella replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "My duty to the crown comes first. It always has and always will. Thomas will have to understand that some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good." Edmund had heard enough. The combination of betrayal, heartbreak, and rage that surged through him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He pushed open the door and stepped into the room, causing all 3 occupants to freeze in shock. "Your Majesty," Marcus stammered, immediately rising to his feet and attempting an awkward bow. The children's book tumbled from Isabella's lap as she instinctively pulled Thomas closer to her chest. "Don't," Edmund said coldly, raising his hand to stop Marcus's gesture of respect. "Don't you dare bow to me after what you've done to my marriage and my kingdom." Isabella's face had gone completely pale, but she lifted her chin with the dignity that had characterized her throughout their marriage. "Edmund, I can explain everything. Please let me explain." Edmund's voice rose despite his efforts to maintain royal composure. "Explain how you've been living a double life for years while I've been governing our kingdom under the assumption that our marriage was built on mutual respect and honesty. Explain how you've been bringing another man's child into our private residence without my knowledge." Thomas began to cry at the tension in the room, burying his face in Isabella's shoulder. The sound of the frightened child only intensified Edmund's emotional turmoil. This innocent little boy was caught in the middle of circumstances beyond his understanding or control. Marcus stepped forward protectively. Your Majesty, Thomas is just a child. Whatever anger you feel toward Isabella and me, please don't direct it at him. I am well aware that he is a child, Edmund replied tersely. What I am struggling to understand is how my wife has managed to maintain a relationship with you and serve as mother to your son, while simultaneously fulfilling her duties as Queen of Valdoria. Isabella finally found her voice, though it trembled slightly as she spoke. Edmund, Marcus is not just anyone. He is Thomas's father, yes, but he was my first love from before our marriage was arranged. When we were forced apart by royal protocol, I thought I would never see him again. But 3 years ago, we encountered each other by chance in the city, and we realized that our feelings had never truly died. The confession hit Edmund like a physical blow. Not only had Isabella been unfaithful, but she had been carrying a torch for another man throughout their entire marriage. Every moment of apparent contentment they had shared had been built on a foundation of lies and unfulfilled longing. So our entire marriage has been a pretense? Edmund asked, his voice now deadly quiet. 35 years of shared responsibilities, public appearances, and private moments have meant nothing to you? That's not fair, and you know it, Isabella replied, standing up while still holding Thomas. I have served this kingdom faithfully for decades. I have been a good queen, a good representative of the crown, and a good partner in governance. My personal feelings do not diminish my commitment to duty. But they certainly explain the distance I've always felt between us, Edmund said bitterly. I thought it was simply the nature of arranged marriages, that affection would grow slowly over time. I never imagined that you were secretly pining for another man and eventually acting on those feelings. Marcus had remained silent during this exchange, but now he spoke up with quiet dignity. Your Majesty, Isabella never sought out this situation. Our meeting 3 years ago was completely accidental, and we both tried to ignore our feelings out of respect for your marriage and her position. But sometimes the heart cannot be denied, and Thomas's existence is proof of that truth. Don't lecture me about matters of the heart, Edmund snapped. And don't speak to me about respect when you've been carrying on an affair with my wife under my own roof. The conversation continued for another hour, with accusations, explanations, and painful revelations flowing between the three adults, while little Thomas dozed fitfully in Isabella's arms. By the time Edmund left the reading room, the foundations of everything he had believed about his life and marriage lay in ruins around him. The following morning brought no relief from the emotional devastation of the previous evening's discoveries. Edmund had spent the entire night pacing his chambers, trying to process the magnitude of Isabella's betrayal and decide on his next course of action. As the sun rose over the palace grounds, he realized that this was no longer merely a personal matter between husband and wife. The stability of the monarchy itself was now at stake. Edmund's first instinct was to confront Isabella immediately and demand her departure from the palace. The rage that burned in his chest made it difficult to think clearly about the broader implications of their situation. However, 30 years of royal training had taught him to consider the political ramifications of every decision, especially those made in moments of high emotion. A quiet knock at his chamber door interrupted his tormented thoughts. His private secretary, Lord Pemberton, entered with the morning briefings and a concerned expression that suggested he had noticed the king's obvious distress. Your Majesty, Pemberton said carefully, I've prepared the daily reports, but if you prefer to postpone this morning's schedule due to personal matters, I can certainly make the necessary arrangements. Edmund studied his trusted advisor's face and realized that Pemberton likely knew more about Isabella's secret than he was letting on. The palace staff was remarkably efficient at managing royal affairs discreetly, which meant they had probably been facilitating Isabella's clandestine meetings for years without his knowledge. Lord Pemberton, Edmund said slowly, I need you to answer a question with complete honesty, regardless of any instructions you may have received from the Queen. How long has the staff been aware of Queen Isabella's external relationships? Pemberton's uncomfortable silence confirmed Edmund's suspicions. After a long moment, the elderly man sighed deeply and met the king's eyes directly. Your Majesty, the household staff has been aware of Her Majesty's occasional visitors for approximately 3 years. We were instructed to maintain absolute discretion and were told that these meetings concerned private charitable work that required confidentiality. And you never thought to inform me of these unusual arrangements? Sir, Queen Isabella specifically requested that you not be disturbed with what she characterized as routine administrative matters. Given her long history of managing various charitable initiatives independently, we had no reason to question her instructions. Edmund nodded grimly, understanding that Isabella had manipulated the loyalty and discretion of the palace staff to maintain her deception. The realization that so many people had been unknowingly complicit in hiding her secret family added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating situation. "I need you to arrange a private meeting with Archbishop Morrison this afternoon," Edmund instructed. "Also, please contact our legal advisors and have them prepare a comprehensive briefing on matters related to royal marriage dissolution." Pemberton's eyes widened slightly, but his professional training prevented him from expressing shock at this request. "Of course, Your Majesty. Shall I indicate any particular urgency for these appointments?" "Extreme urgency," Edmund replied. "And, Pemberton, everything we have discussed this morning is to remain absolutely confidential until I determine how to proceed publicly." After Pemberton departed to make the necessary arrangements, Edmund attempted to focus on his regular duties, but found concentration nearly impossible. Every document he reviewed seemed meaningless in light of the personal crisis that now dominated his thoughts. The irony was not lost on him that he was struggling to govern effectively at the very moment when strong leadership was most needed. Around midday, Edmund decided he could no longer avoid facing Isabella directly. He found her in the morning room, calmly working on correspondence as if nothing had changed between them. Her composure was both impressive and infuriating, given the circumstances. "Isabella," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss the practical implications of what I discovered last night." She looked up from her writing with an expression of resignation mixed with defiance. "I assumed we would need to have this conversation eventually. I suppose I should be grateful that we managed to maintain our arrangement for as long as we did." "Our arrangement?" Edmund's voice rose despite his efforts to remain calm. "Is that how you characterize our marriage? As an arrangement that you've been circumventing for years?" "Please don't be naive, Edmund," Isabella replied with surprising sharpness. "Our marriage was always an arrangement, negotiated between kingdoms for political advantage. The fact that we developed mutual respect and affection over time doesn't change the fundamental nature of what brought us together. But it should have prevented you from seeking intimacy elsewhere and bearing another man's child," Edmund countered. "Whatever the origins of our marriage, we made vows to each other that you have systematically violated." Isabella set down her pen and fixed him with a steady gaze. "I have honored my vows to serve as your queen and partner in ruling this kingdom. I have never allowed my personal relationships to interfere with my official duties or compromise the dignity of the crown. What I have done in my private time, with my personal feelings, should not be subject to your judgment." The audacity of this response left Edmund momentarily speechless. Isabella was essentially arguing that infidelity was acceptable as long as it didn't interfere with royal obligations, a perspective that completely ignored the emotional and moral dimensions of their relationship. "Your private time?" he finally managed. "Isabella, you brought another man's child into our private residence. You used palace staff and resources to facilitate secret meetings with your lover. You have been living a double life that makes a mockery of everything we've built together. How can you possibly characterize this as a purely private matter?" Isabella's composure finally cracked slightly, and Edmund could see tears forming in her eyes. "Because I love them, Edmund. I love Marcus in a way that I have never been able to love you, despite all my efforts and good intentions. And Thomas is the child I never thought I could have, the family I always dreamed of but sacrificed for duty." This confession was perhaps more painful than anything else she could have said. Edmund had always known that their marriage lacked the passionate love he had observed in other couples, but he had convinced himself that their partnership was built on something more stable and enduring than mere emotion. To learn that Isabella had been capable of such deep love, just not with him, felt like a fundamental rejection of his worth as a man and husband. "So what do you propose we do now?" Edmund asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion and heartbreak. "Do you expect to continue your double life indefinitely? Do you want to bring Marcus and Thomas into the palace permanently? Or are you prepared to choose between your royal duties and your secret family?" Isabella was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of each option. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Edmund. I honestly don't know how to resolve this situation without destroying everything that matters to me." The conversation ended without resolution, but Edmund knew that a decision would have to be made soon. The stability of the monarchy, the integrity of the royal succession, and his own emotional well-being all hung in the balance, waiting for a choice that would irrevocably alter the course of their lives and their kingdom's future. The meeting with Archbishop Morrison proved to be as difficult as Edmund had anticipated. The elderly clergyman listened with growing concern as the king outlined the situation with Queen Isabella, occasionally shaking his head in dismay at the complexity of the moral and legal challenges involved. "Your Majesty," the archbishop said when Edmund finished his explanation, "this is indeed a most unprecedented situation. In my 40 years of service to the church and the crown, I have never encountered circumstances quite like these. The implications for both canon law and civil law are extraordinarily complex." Edmund leaned back in his leather chair, feeling the weight of his crown more acutely than ever before. "Archbishop, I need to understand all of our options, regardless of how painful or complicated they might be. The current situation is unsustainable, and I cannot continue to rule effectively while my personal life remains in such turmoil." "Of course, Your Majesty. Let me outline the primary considerations we must address." The archbishop consulted his notes carefully. "First, there is the matter of annulment versus divorce. Given that your marriage has lasted 35 years and has been consummated, annulment would be nearly impossible to obtain. Divorce, while legally possible, would create significant constitutional questions about the succession and the queen's status." "And what about the child?" Edmund asked, though the question pained him deeply. "Thomas has no legal connection to the royal family, but his mere existence complicates everything." "Indeed it does, Your Majesty. If Queen Isabella were to publicly acknowledge Thomas as her son, it would create a scandal that could severely damage the monarchy's reputation. However, if she continues to maintain secrecy about his existence, she will be living with a constant threat of discovery that could prove even more damaging in the long run." The archbishop paused, clearly choosing his next words carefully. "There is also the matter of Marcus, the child's father. His ongoing presence in this situation creates additional risks and complications that must be addressed." Edmund had been dreading this aspect of the conversation. Marcus represented not just Isabella's infidelity, but also an ongoing threat to the stability of the royal marriage and the monarchy itself. As long as Marcus remained in the picture, the possibility of further scandal would continue to loom over the crown. "What would you recommend regarding Marcus?" Edmund asked reluctantly. "Your Majesty, I believe that any resolution to this crisis must include provisions for ending Queen Isabella's relationship with Marcus permanently. Whether through voluntary separation or more decisive measures, his continued involvement with the Queen is simply incompatible with the preservation of the monarchy." That evening, Edmund requested a private dinner with Isabella to discuss their options frankly. The formal dining room felt absurdly large for just the two of them, but Edmund wanted this conversation to take place in an official setting that would emphasize the gravity of their situation. "Isabella," he began once the servants had withdrawn, "I've spent considerable time today consulting with our legal and religious advisors about how to proceed. We have several options available to us, but none of them will be easy or pleasant." Isabella set down her wine glass and looked at him directly. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Edmund, but I suspect I already know what choices you're going to present to me." "Do you?" Edmund challenged. "Then, please, enlighten me about your understanding of our situation." "You're going to ask me to choose between my royal duties and my family," Isabella said with quiet resignation. "You want me to give up Marcus and Thomas permanently in exchange for maintaining my position as queen, or you want me to abdicate my royal status and leave the palace forever?" Edmund was surprised by the accuracy of her assessment. "You're correct about the fundamental choice, but there are additional considerations that complicate each option significantly." He outlined the legal implications that Archbishop Morrison had explained, including the constitutional questions that would arise from either divorce or abdication. He also explained the potential scandal that Thomas's existence could create if it became public knowledge, and the ongoing security risks posed by Marcus's knowledge of royal family secrets. "There is one additional option," Edmund said finally, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "We could attempt to maintain the status quo by formalizing more discreet arrangements for your external relationships." Isabella looked surprised by this suggestion. "What do you mean by formalizing discreet arrangements?" "I mean that we could establish a separate residence for Marcus and Thomas, provide them with financial support, and allow you to visit them occasionally under carefully controlled circumstances." In exchange, you would need to commit to absolute discretion and agree that these relationships would never again interfere with royal duties or threaten the monarchy's stability. The proposal felt like cutting out his own heart, but Edmund had considered it as a way to minimize the broader damage to the kingdom while acknowledging the reality of Isabella's emotional attachments. Isabella was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the implications of each option. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with emotion, but also surprisingly resolute. "Edmund, I need you to understand something that I should have told you years ago. My relationship with Marcus isn't just about romantic love or even about Thomas. It's about the person I am when I'm not being Queen Isabella. When I'm with them, I can simply be Bella, a woman who laughs at silly jokes, cries during sad movies, and worries about whether her child is eating enough vegetables." She paused, wiping away tears that had begun to fall. "I have spent 35 years being the perfect queen, the perfect royal wife, the perfect representative of dignity and duty. I have never complained about the sacrifices required by royal life, and I have never asked for anything that would compromise my obligations to the crown. But now you're asking for exactly that," Edmund pointed out gently. "No," Isabella replied firmly. "Now I'm being forced to choose between my duty and my heart because you've discovered something that I hoped to keep private forever. I never wanted to hurt you, Edmund. I never wanted to damage the monarchy or create a crisis for the kingdom. I simply wanted to love and be loved in return." The raw honesty of her words cut through Edmund's anger and forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about their relationship. Had he ever truly tried to connect with the woman behind the crown? Had he ever encouraged Isabella to express her authentic self rather than simply fulfilling her royal role? "What do you want to do, Isabella?" he asked quietly. "If you could choose freely, without considering consequences or obligations, what would you do?" Isabella looked at him with an expression of profound sadness. "I would leave with Marcus and Thomas tomorrow, and I would never look back. But I can't choose freely, can I? None of us can. We're all trapped by duty, tradition, and the expectations of an entire kingdom." The conversation continued late into the night, but by morning, both Edmund and Isabella knew that their marriage, as they had known it, was over. The only question remaining was how to end it with the least damage to everyone involved, including the innocent child who had become the unwitting catalyst for their crisis. The final resolution came 3 weeks later, after extensive consultations with constitutional lawyers, church officials, and trusted members of parliament. Edmund had insisted on complete transparency with his closest advisors, understanding that any solution would require their support and discretion to be successful. The decision was painful but necessary. Isabella would formally abdicate her position as Queen of Valdoria, citing personal health concerns that required her to step back from public life. This explanation would allow her to leave with dignity while avoiding the scandal that would result from public knowledge of her affair and secret child. Edmund would continue to rule as king, supported by a regency council until arrangements could be made for the succession. There would be no immediate remarriage, as Edmund felt emotionally and politically unable to consider such a step in the foreseeable future. Marcus and Thomas would be relocated to a private estate in the countryside, far from the capital and royal residences. Isabella would join them there, living quietly as a private citizen under her maiden name. Financial arrangements had been made to ensure their comfort and security, but with strict conditions regarding contact with the royal family and public appearances. The morning of Isabella's departure was gray and drizzling, matching the somber mood that had settled over the palace. Edmund watched from his study window as Isabella's belongings were loaded into an unmarked carriage, accompanied by only a small retinue of loyal servants who had requested permission to accompany her into exile. Before leaving, Isabella requested a final private meeting with Edmund. They met in the same reading room where Edmund had first discovered her secret, a location that now seemed heavy with the weight of everything that had been lost. "I want you to know," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, "that I have never regretted our years together as partners in ruling this kingdom. You are a good king, Edmund, and a good man. I hope that someday you will find the happiness that has always eluded us." Edmund struggled to find words that could encompass everything he was feeling. "Isabella, I wish things could have been different between us. I wish I could have been the husband you needed, rather than simply the king you served. We both did our duty," Isabella replied gently. "Perhaps that's enough, even if it wasn't everything we might have hoped for." They embraced briefly, formally, and then Isabella was gone. Edmund watched the carriage disappear down the tree-lined drive, carrying away 35 years of shared history, and the woman who had been his queen, his partner, and ultimately his greatest heartbreak. The public announcement of Queen Isabella's abdication was met with surprise and concern throughout the kingdom, but the carefully crafted explanation of health concerns was accepted without significant questioning. The palace's reputation for discretion and dignity helped maintain the fiction that this was simply an unfortunate but straightforward medical situation. In the months that followed, Edmund threw himself into his royal duties with renewed focus, perhaps trying to fill the emotional void left by Isabella's departure through increased dedication to governance. The kingdom continued to function smoothly under his leadership, though those closest to him noticed a sadness in his demeanor that never quite disappeared. Occasionally, Edmund received discreet reports about Isabella's life in the countryside. She had apparently adapted well to private life, finding joy in simple domestic activities and watching Thomas grow up in a normal family environment. Marcus had proved to be a devoted partner and father, providing the emotional support and authentic love that Isabella had always craved. These reports brought Edmund a complex mixture of pain and satisfaction. While it hurt to know that Isabella had found with another man the happiness that had eluded them together, he was genuinely glad that she was no longer trapped in a role that had required her to suppress her true self. 2 years after Isabella's departure, Edmund was approached by several advisors about the possibility of remarriage. The succession question remained unresolved, and there was political pressure to secure the monarchy's future through a new alliance. However, Edmund found himself reluctant to consider such arrangements, perhaps having learned from his first marriage that political unions could not guarantee personal fulfillment for either party. Instead, Edmund chose to focus on preparing his nephew, Prince Alexander, as his eventual successor. Alexander was intelligent, dedicated, and genuinely committed to serving the people of Valdoria. More importantly, he had married for love rather than political convenience, giving Edmund hope that the next generation of royals might achieve the balance of duty and happiness that had proven so elusive for his own generation. As the seasons passed and the immediate crisis faded into memory, Edmund began to understand that Isabella's betrayal, while devastating, had also revealed important truths about their relationship and his own emotional limitations. The discovery of her secret family had forced him to confront the reality that their marriage had been built on convenience and obligation rather than genuine intimate connection. In quiet moments, Edmund sometimes wondered what might have happened if he had been more attentive to Isabella's emotional needs earlier in their marriage. Could he have prevented her affair by being a more loving husband? Or were they simply too different, too shaped by duty and protocol, to ever achieve the kind of authentic partnership that Isabella had found with Marcus? These questions would never be fully answered, but they served as important lessons for Edmund's approach to relationships and leadership going forward. He became more attuned to the emotional needs of those around him, more willing to show vulnerability and seek genuine connections rather than simply maintaining professional courtesy. The story of King Edmund and Queen Isabella became a private tragedy that shaped the rest of Edmund's reign, teaching him that even the most carefully constructed public lives can conceal profound private struggles. Their tales served as a reminder that duty and love, while both noble ideals, do not always align in ways that allow for easy resolution or happy endings. In the end, perhaps the greatest tragedy was not that Isabella had found love elsewhere, but that she and Edmund had never been able to find it together, despite decades of shared responsibility and mutual respect. Their story became a testament to the complex relationship between personal happiness and public obligation, and the sometimes impossible choices that arise when the two come into conflict.